Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Garrett Hake in Washington, where we begin with breaking news and the latest on that historic prisoner swap today, the largest and most significant exchange of its kind since the Cold War. The massive deal secures the release of 16 people detained in Russia, including Americans Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan. This was the scene earlier today. Russia's security service released this video appearing to show some of those Americans on a Russian airfield, then being transported to a plane bound for Ankara, Turkey, where the swap took place. The White House says they are wheels up now from Turkey and are headed to the U.S., where later tonight, President Biden and Vice President Harris will welcome them home at Joint Base Andrews, just outside of Washington. The freed Americans are Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was detained last year and just last month sentenced to 16 years in a Russian prison. Paul Whelan, a Marine veteran who had been detained since 2018, and Alsu Kurmasheva, a journalist with Radio Free Europe. Vladimir Kara-Murza, a green card holder, Russian opposition activist, and Pulitzer Prize winner, was also freed and is heading to Germany. This afternoon, President Biden met with family members who were able to speak by phone to their loved ones for the first time since their release. With those family members standing beside him, President Biden had a simple message for the freed prisoners. Welcome home.
Their brutal ordeal is over, and they're free. This is an incredible relief for all the family members gathered here. It's a relief to the friends and colleagues all across the country who've been praying for this day for a long time. The deal that made this possible was a feat of diplomacy and friendship. Multiple countries helped get this done. They joined the difficult, complex negotiations at my request, and I personally thank them all again. We stand for freedom, for liberty, for justice, not only for our own people, but for others as well. And that's why all Americans can take pride in what we've achieved today.
This deal itself was a massive diplomatic undertaking among 7 different countries involving 24 individuals that took years to put together, according to officials. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan spoke to reporters shortly after the president's remarks, touting the diplomatic effort and getting emotional about his interactions with those American families.
I spent a lot of time with the families of Evan and Paul and Alsu, and most of the time, as you can imagine, those are tough conversations. But not today. Today, excuse me. Today was a very good day.
In the exchange, Russia secured the release of 8 people, the most notable, Vadim Krasikov, a Russian hitman who is serving a life sentence in Germany for the murder of a Chechen dissident in what prosecutors said was a Russian state-sanctioned assassination. According to a senior administration official, Russia would not agree to a deal that did not involve Krasikov, which prompted President Biden's direct engagement with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who told the president, quote, "For you, I will do this." And while celebrating the day, the administration is also cautioning that this isn't some kind of breakthrough in the U.S.-Russia relationship or an easing of tensions with Moscow as Putin continues to wage war in Ukraine. For more on all of this, I'm joined by a fantastic team today. NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba is here on set. NBC's Courtney Kube is at her post at the Pentagon. NBC Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons joins us from Paris. And I'm also joined by Peter Baker, who is the Moscow bureau chief for the Washington Post and is now chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and an NBC News political analyst. So, Monica, tell us a little bit more about how this deal came together. This wasn't something that just happened. This was years in the making. Years
of intensive diplomatic efforts, Garrett. And we know that really this stretched on for nearly 2 years, ever since Brittany Griner was released in that deal and Paul Whelan was effectively left behind. There were questions about what would go into a deal that could secure his release. And then, of course, we know once Evan Gershkovich was arrested and detained, there were questions about whether there could be something that could involve both of them, in addition to the other wrongfully detained Americans. But this was something really where President Biden, behind the scenes, was trying to do more than could be ever conceded to publicly. And that is why they were trying to be so careful about what they could say. But we know that effectively there was that breakthrough in January once Germany was on board. That was a key puzzle piece to all of this. And that is something that the White House is attributing to these decades-long relationships and foreign policy expertise that President Biden has with some of these leaders, with some of these contacts, to be able to say that these alliances are what led ultimately to this deal today. Now, the other key piece of this was that just a couple of weeks ago, they weren't sure if Russia was going to accept the deal on the table. It was notable because a couple of weeks ago, the White House was sort of bracing for a response to it once they were able to at least sign on to what was initially there. They wanted to be really, really careful about how they were going to tell the families because you don't want to get people's hopes up. But they have had regular meetings with most of these family members who have been demanding more and who have been trying more publicly to call for the release of some of their loved ones. And ultimately, the White House today tried to do a lot of this behind the scenes so that now we can see the images that will be more joyful when they're reunited this evening play out publicly, Garrett.
Clearly a lot of personal engagement from the president. What else can you tell me about what the U.S. and our allies gave up in this exchange? We mentioned Krasikov. The Russian release on this talks about minors, children. What do you know?
Exactly. And the U.S. had to release essentially 3 Russian prisoners. And in addition to that, the other countries that you mentioned at the top had to release Russians as well in order to get this deal done. And so this is because there are so many individuals involved in so many countries. It's effectively the largest prisoner exchange deal since the Cold War. And this was something that President Biden was asked about because this does raise this larger question of, well, what kind of an incentive are you giving to certain countries, to certain leaders to detain Americans who might be traveling abroad if they see that there's a deal like this that could come from it? And the president said, look, if there are innocent people being held, innocent Americans anywhere, my job is to get them home. And he said really that that was something that he weighed, but determined the benefit outweighed any of the risk of what kind of a message it sends. And he also said that people need to maybe heed warnings more closely about traveling to these places where they could be held, and that that's something that maybe the administration is going to continue to tell people as a warning, even though there are still many other Americans who are being held that they still want to work on to free as well.
Yeah, the State Department's been very clear. Now is not the time to go to Russia. What more do we know about how many Americans are still in Russian custody tonight?
And so President Biden and his administration have been proud to say that during their term, they've been able to free dozens of Americans, but there are still dozens more that are being held, including some in Russia. And that includes Mark Fogel, who for years they've been trying to see if it's possible to secure his release. He was not able to be a part of this deal, this particular deal, but they're pointing to the fact that, well, Paul Whelan wasn't a part of the deal that included Brittany Griner. You can always go back to the table and keep trying to pursue these kinds of negotiations. And the president and Jake Sullivan reiterated that today, that they will essentially start, they may celebrate a little bit tonight, have a little bit of a victory lap, but tomorrow they go back to work on trying to get some of these Americans out too, Garrett.
Always more to do. Monica Alba, thank you for that reporting. I want to bring in Keir Simmons, who is so often our man in Russia. Keir, what are we hearing from Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin tonight? Are they declaring victory over this as well?
Oh, I think that they will be looking to send a message to Russia that President Putin got their people home, and a message too to his intelligence and security services that he got their people home. And we're actually seeing now in the last hour pictures from Russia of President Putin greeting these Russians on the tarmac with flowers, including a man and wife spying team and their children stepping off the plane and embracing President Putin. Putin doesn't need to say anything for you to get the message. And they also have broadcast the images of them marching the Americans and others onto planes to send them back. So, yeah, I mean, clearly, President Putin wanted this deal. You heard there, Monica outline well exactly who he wanted most. He certainly wanted the assassin in Germany to be among these people, and frankly, I suspect held up the negotiations until that was possible, which involved this diplomatic dance, if you like, with Germany to try to get that to be able to happen. And he will be in the Kremlin now thinking that he has achieved a success with this. I do think that aside from the questions that there will be about whether this encourages Russia or other adversaries of the US to carry out arrests like this, even you could call it hostage taking, I think also it is a signal of the new era that we live in, because we haven't seen anything like this since the Cold War. There are those who suggest that we are now in a kind of a new Cold War, a Cold War 2.0, if you like. I think it does it is going to raise questions for Americans and other Westerners about where in the world you can go now. And all of that feels eerily familiar, doesn't it? It feels familiar with decades ago and that Cold War era.
No, you're absolutely right. And Kira, I should point out, you're in Paris tonight. You've been covering the Olympics. What's the reaction to this been like on the continent, where Russia is obviously a much more present threat in a lot of ways? You mentioned Germany. A lot of work had to be done to make that release possible there. What are you hearing?
That's right, and the German Chancellor, Chancellor Scholz, has just been saying how difficult a decision this was, at the same time saying that he will greet a German who's been released from Belarus. He will greet him later today. So you do have potentially this extraordinary split screen, but more than a split screen, actually, a kind of a multi-screen, right, with President Putin greeting Russian people there in Russia, and President Biden meeting with the families and getting ready to greet those Americans returning home, and the German Chancellor doing the same. The Germans were reluctant to do this, and for good reason, because the person that they have released was an assassin. He killed somebody in a park in Germany. He was in jail for murder. And I think the Germans fully understood how difficult this would be to explain to the German people, particularly if it was, if you like, only Americans that were released. That has, the White House has managed to ensure that isn't the case, but that made it all the more complex.
All right, Keir Simmons, appreciate you staying up late for us in Paris tonight. I want to turn down to Courtney Kube at the Pentagon. And Courtney, what more can you tell us about the kind of back-channeling that was going on in the intelligence community, at the military level perhaps, that it takes to get a deal like this done?
You know, we often hear this term whole of government approach, but I have to say in this case, the details that we've been learning about exactly how this prisoner swap came together, there really were multiple agencies within the U.S. government that were brought in to try to make this thing happen. And Garrett, it happened over several years. So you'll recall that there was a swap of Brittany Griner, the U.S. basketball player, some time ago when she was returned. What became very clear, even before the negotiations concluded for her release, was that Vladimir Putin was not going to agree to a release of Paul Whelan and others like Evan Gershkovich unless he got one specific person, and that is Vadim Krasikov. He's a FSB assassin, really. There's really no other way to put it. Someone for the Russian intelligence services, an assassin who is being held in Germany accused of murder. Vladimir Putin made it very clear that he needed to be released. And once that was clear to the U.S. government, they were able to start working with German officials to try to secure some sort of a deal. Once it was clear that the German government was willing to do that, that was when the other dominoes started to fall into place here. But this took several years. And again, when it became clear to the U.S., to the Biden administration, that without Vadim Krasikov, this wasn't going to happen, they started working, and specifically Secretary of State Antony Blinken and CIA Director Bill Burns started working on a way to make that happen. They expanded the aperture from just looking at some of the Americans like Paul Whelan to a larger prisoner swap, which is what we got here today. Multiple countries involved. We did see Vadim Krasikov. We saw some Russian media actually showing him arriving in Moscow late tonight. Vladimir Putin at the plane there at the arrival to greet him, along with the others who were released today. Garrett.
Interesting to see them making a convicted assassin into a political hero in Russia. Courtney, these hostages are going to end up in San Antonio at a military base for treatment. That's where all these hostages who we get back end up. You've covered this kind of thing for a while. What kind of care, what kind of support do they get in San Antonio? What's their why?
Yeah, and the sad reality is because there have been so many Americans who've been held, whether it's in prison, like someplace like in Russia, or whether it's held by a terror group throughout the world. The sad reality is because there have been so many Americans who've returned from these sorts of situations that the military has really perfected this process. It's something that they call PISA. It's done at San Antonio, as you mentioned, at a place called Brooke Army Medical Center. It's a minimum of a 2-week process where they go through, they can talk to counselors, psychologists. Garrett, the reality is some of these people are coming back from extremely harsh conditions. Things like they may not be used to sleeping in a bed anymore. Some of them may not even be acclimated to sunlight when you think about someone like Bo Bergdahl, who came back after being held in Afghanistan and Pakistan for years. They need to be reacclimated to some of the very basics of society. And in addition to the individuals, the prisoners, or in some cases hostages, the clinicians and the therapists there at Brooke Army Medical Center, they'll actually also bring in the family and the caregivers and the loved ones of them to try to help them reacclimate their loved ones in. But this is not always just a 2-week process. Some of them will spend months, if not years, getting reacclimated. They'll also look at them for potential medical problems. In some cases, people will come back and they'll have been exposed to torture, interrogation techniques, and so that they'll be able to look at them and see exactly what their medical situation is as well, Garrett.
A fascinating bit of reporting. Courtney Cuby at the Pentagon, I know you've got a lot more reporting to do, so I will let you go and bring in Peter Baker, who's been covering this beat in one way or another for quite a long time. And Peter, the White House is obviously touting how massive this prisoner swap is, but I think about what Keir was saying and what Courtney was saying and wonder almost, is it easier to do a big deal than a small deal at a certain point? I mean, what do you make of the scale of what was achieved today?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's an old saying, right? I think Mike McFaul, the former ambassador, said it earlier. He said, you know, if you have a problem you can't fix, expand it, right? Sometimes expanding the problem actually is the key to unlocking it, because then you can get a lot of things done all at once. So the Russians basically were able to get back not just Gershkovich, who I think is the #1 person they were really trying to get back, but a whole number of people from different countries like Norway, Slovenia, and Poland. And therefore, they could claim that they, you know, were not backing down, that they got a good deal out of it, just like we would claim the same. I think the Biden administration unable to get Mark Fogel, and it's worth mentioning that he's still in custody, as we just mentioned, but they did throw in some Russian dissidents into this package and German nationals who have also been held by Russia. I think that was really important for Olaf Scholz to get some Russians who had been held in compensance for Vadim Krasnikov. So you've got these Russian dissidents, people like Oleg Orlov, who's head of Memorial, which is the old human rights group. He was imprisoned and sentenced in February for denigrating the Russian military. And Ilya Yashin, an old, longtime opposition figure who was also released. So I think by having more on the table, it allowed both sides to kind of get past the deadlock they had been stuck in for a couple of years.
Now, the White House has been pretty careful to say that this should not be seen as some kind of breakthrough in Russian-American relations. So I guess my question is this purely a one-off, or are we kind of entering a new era here of these kind of swaps being more common as Moscow is likely to continue to detain American and other Western citizens going forward?
Well, we certainly established a channel, right, of communication with Russia, even though we are at odds with them, of course, in Ukraine. And so that channel will be used again, presumably, in other circumstances, whether it be, arranging for prisoner swaps or other circumstances, maybe deconflicting to try to avoid accidental conflicts between their militaries and ours. The point is that communication, at least on some level, is important, even with an enemy. But the hope is that there's not going to be a new round of hostage taking. They still have to get Mark Fogel out. They still have others in other countries around the world they want to get out. And the worry, of course, has always been that if you seem to give up something for prisoners, does it encourage countries to take more? That's certainly a criticism you heard today from Republicans. But a long time ago, actually, I've heard President Biden and Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, concluded that that old logic doesn't work anymore, that they should not worry about political costs, and that there was not really any evidence that not trading would somehow stop hostage taking, and that it was better just to get Americans home rather than leave them to rot in Russian dungeons.
On the political element of this, though, there are always domestic politics at play. I think about the politics that perhaps might exist in Germany, but also the politics here. Former President Trump has been saying he could get Evan Gershkovich out no problem after he wins the election, even before he comes back to the White House. How do you think this plays politically on both sides of the Atlantic?
Well, look, they'll both, former President Trump will obviously make his claims, and he'll say that, Putin did it because he's afraid he's coming back, or he did it because Biden is weak, or whatever he wants to say. The fact that Biden is no longer running makes it less, I think, of a salient issue in that sense, because obviously he's now running against Vice President Kamala Harris. She, the White House said she was a part of this, but it really wasn't her deal. It was obviously President Biden's deal, and he's not on the ballot anymore. So that's, less of an issue. Trump makes a lot of claims when it comes to Russia, many of them not founded in any, past experience. And I think the idea that suddenly Vladimir Putin was going to kowtow to him and simply give up prisoners for nothing because because he got elected, beggars the imagination. There's no evidence of any history there that would suggest that would be the case. But he's going to say what he's going to say, and he's going to try to make an issue of it on the campaign trail.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of smart people in my line of work have suggested that in terms of the campaign politics, this is probably the most useful thing that President Biden can do for Vice President Harris right now is get this kind of foreign policy work done behind the scenes. Peter Baker, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. I want to bring in now the aforementioned former U.S. ambassador to Russia and NBC News international affairs analyst Michael McFaul. Ambassador, you know Vladimir Kara-Murza. I want to play some of what he said on this broadcast back in 2017 about why he was going back to Russia despite being poisoned twice. Ask you about it on the other side. Let's listen.
Yes, I do want to go back because I think that the work we do, the work of the democratic opposition in Russia is important, and I think we have to continue because there are many, many people in Russia who reject Mr. Putin's regime, who reject its authoritarianism, its corruption, its aggressive stance towards the outside world, and who want to see Russia become a normal, modern, democratic European country. There are many, many people in our country like that, and I think it's important that we continue our work in this direction.
So I'm curious for your reaction to his release and that of the other hostages, but also your thoughts on whether the kind of work he's describing can continue now.
Well, I'm just thrilled that Volodya is out of jail, and I know two other of the people that were released, Ilya Yashin and Oleg Orlov. These are people I've known for decades. They are truly courageous human beings. You just heard how courageous he was. But at this moment in Putin's Russia, I think Vladimir Kara-Murza is more valuable outside of the country than inside. And thank God he's alive, unlike his colleague Alexei Navalny, who died in prison, so that he can continue to do the work abroad. And I just want to applaud. I worked on the swap back in 2010 of spies on our side, alleged spies held by Russia. That was a very difficult negotiation. This was extremely complex, as you've been talking about, multiple countries, divisions within governments themselves. And it is just a tremendous achievement from the Biden administration and their colleagues in these other countries that they got them out, including these Russian opposition and human rights leaders. Fantastic achievement.
And Navalny, who you mentioned, was reportedly set to be part of this deal had it been able to be completed while he was still alive. What do you make of what Russia got in return, their end of this deal? How significant is it for Putin? And, I mean, what kind of player is Krasikov potentially? Is he just some thug, or is he someone who will be held up by the Russian state media and treated as an important figure in all of this?
No, he's not just some thug, although he's thuggish to me. He's an assassin. He's a trained professional assassin that Putin sent to Germany to kill opposition leaders, Chechen opposition people in a park in Berlin. And Putin, to people like that, intelligence officers, FSB officers, SVR, GRU, those are all the acronyms of their various intelligence officers. He has a firm commitment to never leave them behind. And he just kissed them on the tarmac just 10 minutes ago to show to the world, but especially to show to his fighters, both in the intelligence world and the military world, that he's not going to leave them behind. And he is celebrating this as reaffirming his commitment to never leave his folks behind.
A little bit of a sop to his political base in the security services in Russia, essentially. I want to ask you about the German role in all of this. Obviously, they did play a significant role here. The reporting based out of the White House is that there was a personal element here between the chancellor there and President Biden. Based on what we know now, do you think this is a deal that could have come to fruition in a Trump administration or a Harris administration, for that matter?
Obviously, I don't know the answer to that question, and the timing is curious to me, because if you'd asked me 2 days ago, will this deal happen now or on the Trump clock, I would have said Putin would wait to reward his friend and partner and person he's been supportive for many years, Donald Trump. I think,
do you have any thoughts as to why he didn't make that calculation?
Well, I'm just speculating, right, based on no data, but I think it's allowed. Thank you. In my world, sometimes in academia, it's not allowed. Here's what I think might have been the key. super complicated deal, right? Many countries involved, many allies of the United States involved, but the central one was Germany. Close personal relationship between the president and the chancellor, and the guy that Putin wants the most is in Germany, Krasnikov, this killer. If Mr. Trump was in power, we don't know what that relationship would be with the German chancellor, and maybe he would not have been able to pull off this very complicated deal. And so maybe he worried about that and thought better to take the deal that we have in hand, because it might not be so easy to reconstruct with a different president, with a different relationship with the chancellor, by the way, with a different relationship with our intelligence community. I won't be surprised when we know the tick-tock on this if Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, somebody with deep personal connections with all of these players, including the Russians, you take him out of the equation, you might not be able to get this deal done either. So I'm just speculating, but that would be a reason to suggest that Putin decided to do it now rather than risk it in the future.
Somebody's going to write a book on Bill Burns' work behind the scenes there and in Israel as well. There's been a lot of great reporting on that. Ambassador McFaul, we could do the rest of the show on this, but alas, we got to go.
Don't forget, though, don't forget his last book, Bill Burns' book, the title is Back Channel. And that's exactly what he's really good at. He's got volume 2 to write now. All
right. Well, thank you for sticking with us as this breaking news develops. And up next, we'll get the view from Congress on this massive multinational prisoner swap with Republican Congressman Mike Lawler, who's a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, joining me next. You're watching Meet the Press now.
This deal would not have been made possible without our allies. Germany, Poland, Slovenia, Norway, and Turkey, they all stepped up, and they stood with us. They stood with us. And they made bold and brave decisions, released prisoners being held in their countries who are justifiably being held, and provided logistical support to get the Americans home. So for anyone who questions whether allies matter, they do. They matter.
Speaking to reporters now on the tarmac in Houston on this topic. Let's listen.
Atrocious and devastating circumstances. Russian authorities arrested, convicted them in sham trials, and sentenced them to long prison terms. This has been an appalling perversion of justice. Over many years, President Biden and I and our team have engaged in complex diplomatic negotiations to bring these wrongfully detained Americans home. We never stopped fighting for their release. And today, in spite of all of their suffering, it gives me great comfort to know that their horrible ordeal is finally over. This exchange also includes the release of Russian political prisoners, including those who worked with Alexei Navalny. Earlier today, I spoke with Alexei's widow, Yulia, to discuss the significance of their release. And as I told her, this being an additional time from previous conversations with her, the United States stands with all of those who are fighting for freedom in Russia. As we celebrate today's news, we must also keep front of mind that there are other Americans that are unjustly being held in places around the world. And we will never stop fighting for their release. As Vice President, it has been my honor to work alongside our President, Joe Biden, to bring home more than 70 Americans in the last 3.5 years. And we will never waver in our commitment to bring home every American who has been wrongfully detained or held hostage. That is my solemn commitment to my fellow Americans, which I will always honor. Thank you all.
Madam Vice President, will you be meeting Evan and Paul when they
The Vice President speaking to reporters on the tarmac in Houston before coming back to Washington, D.C. I'm joined by Monica Alba. We've been listening to that. Tough to hear some of the remarks, but one thing that came through loud and clear, twice the Vice President making clear this commitment to never stop fighting for the release of people imprisoned abroad, a statement of policy, but also something of a campaign statement for her as well, as she kind of takes the torch here from President Biden on not just this issue, but on the whole international affairs portfolio.
I think that's an absolutely fair read, Garrett. That was clearly, yes, policy and politics together, and that is also why Vice President Harris is going to be there tonight at Joint Base Andrews when the U.S. citizens return, when they are reunited with their family members. President Biden, of course, will be there to greet them, but she felt it was important to be there as well. And we have learned from the White House and from sources that she did have a couple of meetings in February that were critical at the Munich Security Conference right around when the news broke that Alexei Navalny had been killed. And we now know behind the scenes that there was a question then about the deal that was on the table that would have involved him essentially being scuttled at the time and how to revive it. We now know that the vice president had a meeting there with the German chancellor, who became critical in all of this. But she also met with the Slovenian prime minister. And in both of those meetings, she effectively asked some of the staff, some of her aides who were in the room, to leave for a portion of it so that they could have a more private conversation about the reality of trying to get a deal on track to get those Americans released. So she did have some role in this, but it is certainly the president's longer relationships with some of these leaders. But now when we look at how he is effectively passing the torch to her as the Democratic nominee that he is backing, that she's the one now who will also campaign on her own foreign policy promises, and that will include to continue to try working to bring other Americans back home.
Right. They certainly hope the political benefits accrue to her. Monica Alba, thank you for that reporting. You'll be at Joint Base Andrews tonight for the ceremony, or the return tonight. We look forward to that as well. And I'm joined now by Congressman Mike Lawler, Republican from New York. He's a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, thank you for joining us on recess here. Your reaction, first of all, just to what we've seen and heard today about this prisoner exchange.
Look, obviously, any day Americans who are wrongly detained or held hostage are released, it's a good day for the United States of America. And obviously, we are very happy that Evan Gershkovich, as well as Paul Whelan, among others, have been released, and certainly are happy for their families. And I do think, obviously, the administration deserves support for having brokered this deal. Certainly, conversely, obviously, when you engage in these negotiations, difficult decisions are made and criminals are released. And we know Vladimir Putin has a history of doing this, knowing full well that he uses it as leverage to get bad actors and folks who engage in his bidding around the globe released, including now a murderer that the Germans released as part of this agreement. And so, it just obviously reinforces the fact that Vladimir Putin is a vile dictator and thug who certainly at some point needs to be held accountable for all of his actions.
Your chairman, Mike McCall, on the Foreign Affairs Committee, released a statement earlier talking about how thrilled he was for the release of these folks, but also making the point that the release of these Russian criminals held in the U.S. and elsewhere, he says, sends a dangerous message to Putin that only encourages further hostage-taking by his regime. You touched on this a little bit, but do you think the U.S. gave up too much here? And how would you propose getting these folks back without making these kinds of deals?
Look, we have obviously seen, going back to President Obama and Vice President Biden and here in the Biden administration, Vladimir Putin has aggressively pursued activity, including war crimes, including seizing of land, and obviously hostage-taking. And I think one of the things that we as a United States need to be clear-eyed about in dealing with Putin and dealing with President Xi in China, in dealing with the Ayatollah in Iran, is that these are not our friends, they're not our allies, and that there needs to be severe consequences for their actions. You look at how those three countries in particular, and you can add in North Korea, but those three countries have worked in a coordinated effort to undermine and destabilize the United States and the free world. Whether you're talking about aggressively invading Ukraine, whether you're talking about the terrorist attacks on Israel, whether you're talking about the illicit oil trade between China and Iran, which is funding the terrorism in the Middle East, We need to be clear-eyed about all of this moving forward. And so to Chairman McCall's point, in dealing with Vladimir Putin, he looks at this in much the way Hamas is looking at holding American hostages in Gaza, including Israeli hostages, is that it is a negotiating tool. It is a tool by which he can gain something. And so, you know, obviously when you do engage in that negotiation, in some respect, it does embolden them. And that is what we've seen even with Hamas continuing to hold 8 Americans hostage, even though they released Israeli hostages a few months ago as part of a negotiation. They continue to hold hostages because they understand its leverage.
I want to play for you another piece of what President Biden had to say today about this deal and why it didn't or did and did not happen previously. Let's listen.
President Trump has said repeatedly that he could have gotten the hostages out without giving anything in exchange. What do you say to that? What do you say to President Trump now, former president?
Why didn't he do it when he was president?
Sir, what is your... A little tough to hear, but I'll pose the question to you that the president got there. Why didn't Donald Trump secure the release of Paul Whelan, for example, when he was president? He often speaks very confidently about his ability to strike such deals.
Well, first of all, again, I think we have to take a step back. This is a good day for America. We have Americans coming home, including Paul Whelan. During the Trump administration, you did have hostages released, as you have here. Evan Gershkovich was taken hostage during the Biden administration. And obviously, both during the Obama administration and the Biden administration, you've had Russian aggression in Ukraine.
Paul Whelan was
this
taken
idea
hostage
that
during the Trump administration.
we're trying to have but the idea, Garrett, that we're trying to have this, well, no, it should have been Donald Trump or it should have been Joe Biden. I mean, come on. At the end of the day, Vladimir Putin is the vile dictator and thug who engaged in this conduct.
Sure.
And ultimately, we want our hostages brought home. We want Americans released. I give the Biden administration credit that they were able to get this deal negotiated. As Chairman McCall and I pointed out in our comments earlier, obviously, when you do engage in these negotiations, we are giving up something. There is a risk that Putin is emboldened to continue to do this aggressively. And that's why it is so important that, as the United States, we understand the threat. And the threat is not each other. It is the vile dictatorship, the despots, the totalitarian regimes of Russia, China, and Iran that seek to undermine and destabilize the United States.
Congressman, I would be remiss not to ask you about the other big campaign news of this week. What is your take on Donald Trump's comments yesterday about Kamala Harris's race?
Look, this election should not be about race. It should not be about gender. It should be about the issues. Under the Biden-Harris administration, we have seen record high inflation, the cost of groceries, the cost of gasoline, the cost of a home mortgage skyrocketing. We've seen a border crisis. We've seen one international crisis after the next. That's what this election should be about and what the focus should be. Any day that anyone is talking about anything other than the issues is a day that they're losing. So for me and in my campaign, I focus on the issues. You know, my opponent, Mondaire Jones, was the third most progressive member of Congress. He agrees with Kamala Harris about defunding the police and open borders and cashless bail and Medicare for all and the Green New Deal. Voters in my district don't agree with that. And so that's where the focus should be, on the issues and nothing else.
A number of positions Harris says she no longer holds, but that is a subject for a whole other interview, another time. Congressman Mike Lawler, I appreciate you coming in again on Recess. Thank you.
Thank you.
And up next, the escalating fallout facing former President Trump after baselessly questioning Vice President Kamala Harris's racial identity in a room full of black journalists. What both presidential campaigns are saying about it is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Vice President Kamala Harris gets a step closer to officially becoming the Democratic nominee today as the DNC begins its virtual roll call to finalize her nomination, which is uncontested. It comes as Harris's rival, former President Donald Trump, is facing new backlash over his combative interview at a convention of black journalists, where he made baseless comments questioning Harris's racial identity, suggesting she decided to, quote, turn black in recent years for political gain. The vice president responded to those comments at an event in Houston last night.
It was the same old show. The divisiveness and the disrespect. The American people deserve a leader who tells the truth, a leader who does not respond with hostility and anger when confronted with the facts. We deserve a leader who understands that our differences do not divide us. They are an essential source of our strength.
The former president, meanwhile, has been doubling down on his comments, posting videos and images referencing the vice president's Indian heritage, suggesting that it somehow proves his point. But Harris has publicly embraced her black identity for decades while also recognizing her South Asian heritage. Speaking to reporters yesterday, including our own Henry Gomez, Donald Trump's VP pick, J.D. Vance, criticized Harris as, quote, chameleon-like and phony.
What he said I thought was hysterical. I think he pointed out the fundamental chameleon-like nature of Kamala Harris. I mean, you guys saw it yesterday. She was in Georgia, and she put on a Southern accent for a Georgia audience. She grew up in Vancouver. What the hell is going on here? She is not who she pretends to be. She's flip-flopped on every issue. She's fake. She's phony.
You described the vice president as a chameleon or chameleon-like. Do you question whether she's black?
Well, Henry, what I question is why she presents a different posture depending on which audience that she's in front of. She'll say one thing to one audience, she'll say another thing to another audience, she'll say something totally different to another audience.
Joining me now from Chicago is NBC's Yamiche Alcindor, who was in that room for the contentious interview, and Dasha Burns, who has the latest from Trump world. Yamiche, let's talk a little bit about the fallout from Trump's comments yesterday. We played a little bit of the vice president there, but what's the reaction been like outside of that?
Well, good afternoon. And really, the reaction has been what was the reaction in the room. I was sitting there about 20 feet away when this interview was taking place, and people in the room, black journalists, this was part of the National Association of Black Journalists annual convention, they were shocked and stunned, and some people were frankly offended, not because they have sort of policy issues that they support with Vice President Harris or with former President Trump, but just the idea that you would question someone's identity in the room full of people who are black. So there's a lot of, I think, real concern about sort of where this goes next, and is this sort of birtherism 2.0, and how we're going to cover that as black journalists, because I think a lot of people are trying to figure out sort of what are the machinations of this. I also, though, I was texting with Harris sources, people that are close to her, people who talk to her regularly. Here's what some of them told me. They said, Donald Trump is completely unhinged. This is also Trump. He cannot help himself. It is completely insulting and repulsive. Another source said, it's simply a lie and easily disproved. She went to Howard, for Christ's sake. She's an AKA. This is painful. And that last part about Howard University, Vice President Harris went to Howard University, a historically black college and university. She also joined a historically black sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And as you said, for years, she's identified herself as both a black woman and Indian. So there are receipts here. And then this kind of gets to the idea of what was happening with President Obama when people were questioning his race and his identity. He also had to sort of talk about the fact that he, for his entire life, had seen himself as a black man. But Kamala Harris has even more receipts, and has receipts going back to when she was a teenager to show that she's constantly talked about her black race and her Indian race.
I think it's pretty clear that Donald Trump was not trying to win over the people in the room with those comments yesterday. Do you have a sense of who his message was for? I mean, his campaign has never made an effort to reach out to moderate swing voters, etc. If you're going to put a strategy to what he said yesterday, who's he talking to?
Well, as someone who's covered Donald Trump since 2016, who has ridden on the Trump plane and who has seen sort of how he's reached out to people who they would say are sort of people who harbor prejudices that maybe they don't feel comfortable saying. I think of one Trump supporter who told me once when I was reporting on him, well, how did you get a job? Isn't it affirmative action that gives you a job? People that say sort of stuff like that, that's sort of just like a little bit insulting, that some people would say is racist, he's appealed to those people. So there might be people living in the suburbs, maybe women, who are looking at Kamala Harris and are just maybe a little uncomfortable with the fact that she's a woman, that she's black, black, that she's Indian, and Donald Trump might be reaching out to them. That's what some of my sources are telling me. The other thing I should say is that there is a sliver, a tiny sliver of the black population that might hear this and say, well, yeah, I also want to question Kamala Harris, and I want to question Vice President Harris's authenticity. Maybe she really isn't black. And those people, though, are going to find, again, if they do just a little bit of research, just a little bit of reading, they're going to find that she went to Howard, pledged AKA, and that she has all sorts of videos, friends that show she has constantly and always talked about being black and Indian. Garrett?
It's very interesting to try to ascribe a real strategy to this. Yamiche, on the Harris beat, we know that DNC virtual roll call is basically underway, which means we're getting closer to a nominee and presumably a running mate. What's the latest?
That's right. Things are moving along. And today I was able to, along with our colleagues, Julie Sirkin and others, we were able to confirm a couple things, that there are 6 contenders that have met with Vice President Harris's vetting team. I want to read them to you. Maybe you'll put them up for folks. There's Tim Walz, Minnesota Governor, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. All 6 of them have met with the Harris team. My understanding is that we're moving into the phase where she is going to be doing some interviews herself, because, of course, come Tuesday, she's going to be on a stage with whoever she picks for a rally in Pennsylvania. Garrett?
Don't worry, Yamiche. We got that graphic for you. Yamiche Alcindor in Chicago. Thank you. Dasha, Donald Trump last night was at a rally in Harrisburg. We were both there. He talked about Harris as a phony. Did you get the sense that he's trying to put some scaffolding around those comments to take what might have been an off-the-cuff line in Chicago and turn it into something that makes political sense in Harrisburg and beyond?
Yeah, it's a good question, Garrett. I think the answer is no, and I say that just based on the evidence in the aftermath of all of this. He has not shied away from those comments. He has continued to post on Truth Social, as you showed there. His allies have been defending those comments. And last night at that rally, there were monitors displaying headlines about her race. So just watching what he has done since, it doesn't seem like he is moving away from that, although I will say there have been some on the right who have come out and said, like Senator Thune and Ben Shapiro, conservative commentator, who said, you know what, maybe better to focus on policy and on her record rather than on her race, Garrett.
Yeah, we just heard it from Mike Lawler. Leading up to Biden dropping out, you and I and other Trump reporters have talked for a long time about how much more disciplined he appeared to be, how much more disciplined his campaign appeared to be. But yesterday was 2016 Trump. How much do you think his sense of how he's doing in this race, the status of the campaign, kind of generates that feeling where he comes out and says really disruptive stuff like what we saw yesterday?
Yeah, really vintage Trump is what we've seen over the last couple of weeks. I mean, look, I think what we're watching right now is the campaign and the former president himself in a recalibration period, trying to figure out how to pivot with this new opponent. And I think for the former president, the gut reaction is to go back to the old hits. His campaign, though, trying out different lines of attack. Again, you know, trying to focus on the border. There were attacks last night at that rally about her wanting to eliminate red meat, focusing on energy, saying she wants electric vehicles, not gas vehicles. So trying to put some of that policy stuff out there. But the former president really getting back to the kind of retro vibes from 2016 that we all remember.
Well, and speaking of retro vibes, the border is still his favorite issue. We had J.D. Vance there in Arizona today. What did he have to say? And is any of that breaking through? Are they able to get back on message to the degree that this isn't the message they want?
Yeah, I mean, going to the border, going to Arizona and having that as a physical, visible TV backdrop for attacking Harris, that was the strategy there. And we really saw him going after her. Take a listen to just some of what he said.
Every time I ask these guys, and I even asked, you know, Brandon, Paul, let's play devil's advocate here. Tell me, has Kamala Harris done anything you've asked her to do? She is the border czar. Has your border czar done anything you've asked her to do? And the answer is no. They send letters, they make phone calls, they are begging the American president and vice president for leadership, and their own border czar ignores them.
And, you know, Garrett, this is an interesting attack line from J.D. Vance himself because of his own personal story. He talked at the border there about growing up with an addicted parent and what that felt like, and that connection to the fentanyl crisis, and being able to relate to some of these families that are dealing with this themselves. So a particularly powerful message potentially coming from J.D. Vance there.
Potentially. We will see if it breaks through. Dasha Burns, thank you for that reporting. And I'm joined now by California Democratic Senator Laphonza Butler. She's also a longtime political ally and confidant of Vice President Harris. Senator, thank you for being with us. I want to start with something you told some of our team on the Hill yesterday. This idea that Trump would get, you said, a reaction that he didn't expect from the black community and the Indian community. As Vice President Harris said, he's been making these kind of statements on the political stage for nearly a decade now. I guess my question is, why should we expect this reaction to be different?
Thanks for having me, Garrett. It's good to be here and talk with you. Look, I think that the comment that I was making to your colleagues on the Hill truly is about how I think the American people are sick of the old tricks. This is the one card that Donald Trump has played since he came down that elevator in 2016, and it is, or escalator, I'm sorry, in 2016. And you know, people have seen him do the bully trick. People have seen him do the name calling trick. People have seen him do the birtherism trick. He's got nothing else but the card of division. And I think that every community that he was trying to insult yesterday, and I think it's not just Black and Indian, but I think it's the American people writ large, are sick of division, are sick of hate, and want leaders that are actually going to bring our country closer together to try to solve problems, which he clearly has no interest in doing.
And politically, then, what do you make of the fact that, as you argue, this is the same old trick over and over again, people are sick of it, and this race is functionally tied?
And the vice president is 10 days in.
Yeah. That's a fair point. It's a new race. I want to ask you a little bit more specifically about the comments from yesterday. Just as an African-American woman, what did you hear from Donald Trump when he was making those comments yesterday to NABJ? Is that a lazy political attack? Is it pure racism? Tell me.
It's Trump's cynicism. It is Trump thinking that he is smarter than everybody else in the room. He showed up at that conference of Black journalists with the absolute intention of saying and doing exactly what he said and did, not to convince any new voters to come to come his way, but to try to be dismissive of the vice president's credentials, to try to somehow suggest that her Blackness or her Indian heritage somehow disqualifies her from being capable of leading the country when she's not only been vice president for the last 3.5 years, but that she was the Attorney General of the state of California, largest state's Attorney General's office in the country. She was the U.S. Senator from the state of California. I think that her credentials stand for themselves, and I think that he was doing the same old thing that he always does.
Before you got to the Senate, you ran a political organization, so you know full well the battleground states could be decided by a few thousand votes here and there, and the margins are really important. Do you think there is any small group, perhaps young Black men, that's who Trump campaigners say they're trying to target, who could be receptive to those comments in an electorally significant way? Like, I'm truly trying to figure out who he thinks he's talking to or who he wants to talk to when he makes comments like that.
You know, Garrett, most importantly, before I came to the United States Senate, I was the president of a labor union. I led a union and worked with women who were caregivers in nursing homes and provided care to seniors and people with disabilities in California. And what I know to be true from the American people who are going to be going into those ballot booths or sitting at their kitchen table filling out their mail-in ballot is that they want a leader who actually has a vision for themselves, their family, and future generations. And so if you are going to spend your time trying to figure out who Donald Trump was talking to, I would say good luck to you. I'm going to spend my time talking to working families all over this country about the vision of the future that Vice President has to bring this country to its next level of excellence for the future generations who deserve so much more than hate and division.
Well, alas, Senator, figuring out who Donald Trump is talking to and what he's trying to say is my job, so I am going to keep trying to do it. I want to ask you, if you would, to put on that political strategist hat here for a minute, because, you know, you do advise the Harris campaign. You talk to Kamala Harris. If you were going to tell them how to make the best political use out of what Donald Trump said yesterday, how would you tell them to kind of highlight or not what Donald Trump said in terms of activating voters?
Look, I think it's a simple equation of acknowledge, reject, and project forward. You've got to, in campaign context, this is an opportunity to use your opponent's words to define him and to define himself, but also paint the clear contrast. And that is what this has to be. He doesn't get to get a free pass for saying the despicable things that he said yesterday. At the same time, we can't dwell there because the American people has no patience for that kind of trash. What they want from public leaders is to have a vision forward. And that's the clear contrast that we have here. And that's, as a strategist, the opportunity that has been given to us.
Well, Senator, I'm almost out of time, so I'll ask you a future forward question. Is there anyone who you have seen from this vice presidential shortlist that we're all familiar with who you think is particularly effective at projecting that kind of future forward leadership and might make a good ticket mate for the vice president?
Garrett, you said yourself, I've worked in politics and around politics for a long time. The answer is they're all great. And she has a great set of candidates to choose from.
All right.
And I'm excited to see who she chooses.
All right, Senator, I appreciate that. You know what my favorite part of the Veep Stakes is? When it's over. So thank you for coming on and talking about this with us. We got to leave it there. I'm back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. The news continues with Tom Costello in for Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.